Everyone thought nerves made Marilyn collapse, but the real reason was shocking. When Marilyn Monroe hit the floor at the Carlyle Hotel, the world thought they were witnessing a legendary star's final breakdown. But as doctors rushed to her side, they found a secret scrawled on a kitchen napkin that would change a dying boy's life forever. This isn't the story of why she fell, it's the story of who she was really falling for. It was 1962, a year that felt like the peak of an era, and Marilyn was the pinnacle of that peak. Every eye in the room was a magnet drawn to the shimmering sheer fabric of her gown that seemed to be held together by nothing more than stardust and hope. To the politicians in their stiff tuxedos and the socialites dripping in emeralds, she wasn't just a woman. She was an icon, a vision of effortless perfection that didn't seem capable of feeling pain, let alone breaking. She moved through the crowd with that signature sway, a glass of bubbly in one hand and the weight of the world's expectations in the other. Her laughter was light like a silver bell echoing against the marble pillars, but if you looked closely, closer than the flashing cameras ever cared to get, you might have noticed the slight tremor in her porcelain hand. It wasn't just nerves, it was the heat of a rising fever radiating through her skin, a fire she was desperately trying to keep hidden under the silk. You might have seen the way her eyes darted toward the shadows of the service entrance every few minutes, as if she were searching for a way out of the very spotlight she had spent her life trying to catch. The music was swell, the band was playing a brassy rendition of a popular tune, and the energy was reaching a fever pitch as the arrival of the president was whispered from ear to ear. Marilyn was expected to perform, to be the Marilyn everyone paid to see, the one who could stop time with a single breathy note. Then the music seemed to sharpen, and the heat in the room became an oppressive wall. Marilyn stopped mid-sentence while talking to a high-ranking official. Her radiant smile didn't just fade, it vanished, replaced by a mask of sudden, chalky paleness. The glass in her hand tilted, the champagne spilling unnoticed onto the expensive carpet. For a heartbeat, the room went silent as the most photographed woman in the world began to sway, not with rhythm, but with a terrifying instability. Her knees buckled beneath the weight of that sequined masterpiece, and before anyone could reach out to catch the falling star, she hit the floor. The sound of her jewelry hitting the hardwood was like the shattering of 1,000 tiny mirrors. The room erupted into a chaos of hushed gasps and frantic movement. "Give her air!" someone shouted while the flashbulbs continued to pop, hungry for the image of a fallen queen. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the ballroom like a wildfire. Stage fright, they said. She was too fragile for the pressure, they claimed. They called it a breakdown of the nerves, a tragic moment of weakness from a woman who couldn't handle the heat of the public gaze. But as the doctors rushed in to carry her away, they didn't see what had happened just moments before the music started. They didn't know that the cause of her collapse had nothing to do with the cameras and everything to do with a secret she was carrying from the service hallway. The public would spend decades debating why her strength failed her in that glamorous moment. They were so busy looking at the star that they completely missed the woman who had entered the kitchen just 30 minutes prior. But 30 minutes before the music started, a woman in a stained apron had caught Marilyn's eye. While the elite were busy adjusting their ties and preening in the gilded mirrors of the grand ballroom, Marilyn had found herself drifting toward the back of the house, away from the artificial glow of the high society lamps. She had claimed she needed a glass of water, a momentary respite from the stifling humidity of adoration, but something deeper was pulling her toward the service entrance. She wasn't running away. She was running toward a truth that the diamonds in the ballroom could never reflect. As she slipped through the heavy swinging doors, the temperature dropped and the heavy scent of roasting meats and floor wax replaced the floral aroma of the party. In the center of that frantic, clattering kitchen stood Mrs. Higgins. She was a woman whose face was a roadmap of a hard life, her back slightly stooped as she stacked heavy silver platters, her hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had no choice but to keep going. Marilyn stood there for a moment, the thousands of hand-sewn crystals on her gown reflecting the harsh fluorescent kitchen lights, making her look like a celestial visitor in a factory. The rest of the catering staff hurried past, too busy to notice the star in their midst, but Marilyn's gaze remained fixed on the woman in the apron. Mrs. Higgins wasn't just tired from a long shift, her eyes were swollen and rimmed with red, the kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix. Every few seconds, she would reach into her pocket, fingers brushing against a crumpled photograph, her breath hitching in a way that she desperately tried to suppress. Marilyn knew that look. It was the look of a woman who was carrying a mountain on her shoulders while trying to pretend it was a feather. Without a word, the most famous woman in the world stepped forward and placed a soft, manicured hand over the woman's rough, chapped fingers. Mrs. Higgins nearly dropped the platter, her eyes widening as she looked up into that famous, luminous face. She started to stammer an apology, tried to pull her hand away in shame of the grease and the stains, but Marilyn wouldn't let go. She squeezed the woman's hand, leaning in close so the sounds of the bustling kitchen wouldn't drown out her whisper. Marilyn didn't ask for an autograph or a favor. She simply looked into the woman's soul and asked, "Who is the boy in the photo, and why are you working tonight with a heart that is so obviously broken?" In that quiet corner of the service hallway, the barriers of fame and status dissolved into the mist of mutual understanding. Mrs. Higgins felt the weight of her secret begin to spill out, drawn by the genuine kindness in Marilyn's expression. She leaned against the cold stainless steel table, her voice trembling as she began to speak about the son who wasn't supposed to make it through the night. If this story is touching your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel so you never miss another moment of the hidden history behind the world's most beloved legends. The waitress began to describe a hospital ward where the lights never truly go dark, and the air is filled with the sound of struggling breaths, unaware that her story was about to change the course of Marilyn's entire evening. In the shadows of the silver platters, the most famous woman in the world heard a story that no newsreel would ever capture. Mrs. Higgins stood there, her voice barely a whisper against the industrial hum of the refrigerators, describing a charity ward in Queens where the white walls were peeling and the radiator hissed like a wounded animal. Her son, little Arthur, was only 8 years old, and he was currently resting in a room that felt more like a hallway, his lungs fighting a battle that the doctor said he was likely to lose by morning. The boy needed a specific type of pressurized oxygen tent, a machine that was available at the private clinic uptown but was far beyond the reach of a woman who made 50 cents an hour carrying trays for the powerful. She was here, in the heart of this glitzy celebration, working a double shift because the hospital had demanded a deposit she didn't have, and every tray she carried was a minute of time she was stealing from her son's final hours. Marilyn listened with a focused intensity, her fingers tracing the rough surface of the waitress's hand as if she were trying to absorb the woman's exhaustion through her skin. She didn't look like a movie star at that moment. She looked like a little girl named Norma Jean who remembered exactly what it felt like to be invisible to the world. She thought of the cold foster homes, the feeling of being a burden on society, and the crushing weight of being poor in a city that only rewards the rich. While the party in the ballroom demanded her presence, her heart was already miles away, sitting in a plastic chair in a crowded ward. Mrs. Higgins explained that she had no choice but to be here because if she left, she would be fired. And if she was fired, the hospital would stop the breathing treatments that were currently keeping the light from going out in her son's chest. The irony was a jagged pill to swallow. Just 30 feet away, men were spending enough on a single bottle of scotch to keep Arthur in that private clinic for a month. Marilyn felt a fire start to burn behind her ribs, a mixture of righteous anger and a deep maternal yearning she had never been able to satisfy in her own life. She looked at the clock on the kitchen wall, 8:30 in the evening. The main event was starting soon, and the Secret Service agents were already scanning the crowd for her. She knew she couldn't just walk out without causing a national incident, but she also knew she couldn't walk back into that ballroom and sing for the powerful while a child was struggling for breath because of a lack of green paper. She leaned into the woman, her voice steady and full of a new, desperate purpose. "You stay here," Marilyn told her, "and you finish this shift with your head held high. You do not leave this post because I am going to make sure the help you need arrives before the clock strikes midnight." Marilyn reached into the small, jeweled clutch she carried, not for a compact or a lipstick, but for the one thing she possessed that could move mountains, the weight of her name. She had lived her life in front of the lens, being whatever people needed her to be, but tonight she decided she would be the miracle that Mrs. Higgins had stopped praying for. She turned back toward the swinging doors, the sequins on her dress catching the light like a warrior's armor. She was about to enter a world of artifice and political games, but the secret she carried was far heavier than any jewel she had ever worn. Compassion is a heavy weight to carry when you're already wearing 20 pounds of sequins. As Marilyn stepped back onto the polished floor of the ballroom, the transition felt like stepping from a freezing rain into a furnace of artificial warmth. The roar of the crowd, the clinking of expensive crystal, and the relentless flash of cameras hit her with a physical force that made her world tilt. She was no longer just the guest of honor. She was a woman whose internal compass had been completely recalibrated by the tears of a kitchen worker. Every step toward the center of the room felt like wading through deep water. her heart pounding against the delicate silk of her bodice as she mentally calculated the time it would take to activate the help she had promised. The physical toll began to manifest in a cold sweat that broke across her brow, hidden only by the expert application of her stage makeup. She hadn't eaten a morsel all day. Her stomach knotted with the usual nerves, but now that anxiety had transformed into a crushing sense of responsibility. She looked at the faces around her, powerful men who could sign away the problems of the world with a flick of a fountain pen, and she felt a sudden, dizzying distance from them. Her breathing became shallow as she navigated the gauntlet of handshakes and hollow compliments, her mind racing with the logistics of contacting her private physician to arrange an immediate transfer for little Arthur. She was spending her own hidden reserve of energy, pouring her life force into the invisible thread connecting her to a child she had never met, ignoring the warning signs of her own body as a high fever began to simmer beneath the surface. The lights seemed to grow brighter, the colors of the room bleeding into one another until the world was nothing but a kaleidoscope of gold and white. She reached out to steady herself against a marble pillar, the cold stone biting into her palm, a stark reminder of the reality she was currently abandoning. The room began to spin, not with the grace of a waltz, but with the violent motion of a ship in a storm. She could hear the band striking up the first chords of her introduction, a brassy, demanding sound that cut through the haze in her mind. Her promise was a tether, keeping her upright for a few more seconds, forcing her to smile when every fiber of her being wanted to crumble under the weight of the grief she had inherited in the kitchen. She was holding this emotional burden with a grip so tight her knuckles were white beneath the surface. She knew she was operating on borrowed time, a machine pushed beyond its breaking point by a soul that refused to look away from suffering. The narrative tension reached a crescendo as she moved toward the microphone, the eyes of the world demanding a performance she was no longer sure she could give. If these stories of hidden compassion touch your heart, please drop a comment below and tell us about a time a stranger's kindness changed everything for you. She reached the center of the stage, the spotlight washing over her like a tidal wave, unaware that the physical strain of her secret act of grace was seconds away from claiming its price. When Marilyn hit the floor, the camera saw a star fading, but one woman in the kitchen saw a hero falling. The sound was not a violent crash, but a soft, tragic rustle of fabric, as if 1,000 white doves had suddenly lost the strength to fly. To the elite guests and the waiting journalists, it was the ultimate spectacle of a fragile idol breaking under the pressure of the bright lights and the daunting expectations of the evening. They captured the image of her slumped against the hardwood, her blonde hair spilling like silk across the floor, and they instantly labeled it as a surrender to nerves or the weight of a lifestyle that had become too much to bear. But the reality was far more profound than any tabloid could ever fathom, for Marilyn had not collapsed because she was weak. She had collapsed because she was empty, having given every remaining ounce of her vitality to a family she didn't even know. In the frantic confusion of the ballroom, doctors and security details rushed to her side, blocking the view with their black-suited forms. But behind the swinging doors of the kitchen, Mrs. Higgins stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth as she watched through a circular glass window. She alone knew the truth of what had transpired in the preceding hour. Marilyn had spent that time not prepping for her performance, but urgently whispering into a service telephone, calling in favors from the only people who would answer her at such an hour. She had negotiated with the heads of private clinics, ignoring her own rising temperature and the gray fog creeping into the edges of her vision, until she secured a promise that a specialist would be at the charity ward by midnight. She had ignored the trembling in her own legs and the lack of air in her own chest, prioritizing the failing breath of an 8-year-old boy over the stability of her own body. By the time she reached that stage, she was walking on nothing but spirit. The high fever she had been battling all evening had reached a breaking point, but she had forced herself to move forward, to keep the secret, to protect the dignity of the waitress she had left behind in the grease-stained hallway. When the lights became too bright and her heart finally slowed, it was the physical manifestation of an exhaustive act of love. She had fainted from the sheer force of caring too much in a world that often cared too little. As the stretcher carried her out into the cool night air, the crowd remained convinced they had witnessed a tragedy of character, never guessing that her stillness was actually a victory of the soul. The public narrative would solidify into a tale of an unstable star, but a very different story was unfolding in a quiet hospital ward across the city. As the world gossiped about the Marilyn breakdown, a private ambulance was arriving to take a small boy away from the peeling walls and into the light of a new possibility. While the city slept, wondering if the star would ever recover her light, a secret journey was beginning that would link a movie icon to a struggling child in a way that time would never truly erase. The next morning, the headlines screamed about her instability, but a quiet black sedan was pulling up to a hospital in Queens. While the city gossiped over coffee, dissecting the footage of her fall, Marilyn was already miles away from the flashbulbs, hidden behind oversized dark glasses and a simple silk headscarf. Her skin was still pale, the lingering effects of the previous night's collapse making every movement feel as though she were walking through heavy velvet. But she refused to remain in bed. She had made a promise in a grease-stained kitchen, and Marilyn Monroe was a woman who knew that a promise made to the invisible was the most sacred of all. She stepped into the sterile, quiet atmosphere of the children's ward, the sharp scent of antiseptic stinging her nose, a stark contrast to the gardenia perfume she had worn at the gala. She moved through the halls unnoticed, a ghost in a place where people were fighting for the right to haunt the world a little longer. When she reached the door of the ESAP private room she had commissioned, she paused, her hand hovering over the cold metal handle. Inside, she saw Mrs. Higgins sitting by a bed that was no longer a makeshift cot but a high-end medical station. The rhythmic hum of a modern oxygen tent provided a steady, reassuring pulse to the room. Little Arthur lay there, his small face framed by pillows that actually felt like clouds, his breathing no longer a ragged struggle but a soft, rhythmic tide. Marilyn didn't enter as the queen of cinema. She crept in like a sister, her heart swelling with a quiet, fierce joy that outshone any applause she had ever received. She approached the bedside with the grace of a woman who had finally found the role she was born to play. From her small bag, she pulled out a modest, leather-bound volume, a book of poetry she had read until the corners were soft and rounded. On the inside cover, in her delicate, looping script, she had written a message that was intended for only one pair of eyes. This was the intimate reality that the cameras at the Carlyle Hotel had failed to capture. It was the inner circle of compassion, where a woman who was loved by millions but understood by few finally found a connection that wasn't based on her silhouette. She sat in the plastic chair next to the waitress, two women bound together by a secret bridge built in the middle of a ballroom disaster. The world outside continued to spin its tales of her fragility, never knowing that she was currently the strongest person in the room. Marilyn stayed for hours, watching the color return to the boy's cheeks, realizing that her collapse had been the cost of buying this moment of peace for a stranger. If this story of hidden grace has touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that the most beautiful things in life are often the ones no one sees. Marilyn leaned down toward the sleeping boy, her voice a soft melody, as she prepared to whisper the words that would ensure his fight was far from over. She leaned over the boy's bed and whispered 12 words that changed his life and hers. The air in the hospital room seemed to hold its breath as the most famous woman in the world moved closer to the sleeping child, her warmth radiating like a soft candle in the sterile blue light of the morning. The smell of expensive gardenia from her hair collided with the sharp, cold scent of alcohol and industrial floor cleaner. She wasn't looking at a fan or a piece of public property. She was looking at a small soul who had been given a second chance because she chose to fall so that he could stand. Her voice was as soft as a silk scarf around her neck, a delicate vibration that bypasses the ears and goes straight to the spirit. The world is waiting for you to get better, so don't be late. As she spoke those 12 words, the boy's eyelids fluttered, a tiny sign of life that made Mrs. Higgins gasp with a mixture of joy and disbelief. Marilyn didn't pull away. She stayed. There, her hand resting near his, bridging the gap between the world of silver screens and the world of silver linings. In that moment, she realized that she needed this connection just as much as the boy needed the air. All her life, she had searched for a family, for a sense of belonging that wasn't tied to the box office or the approval of men in suits. Here, in a quiet ward far from the reach of the paparazzi, she found it in the rhythmic breathing of a child who had no idea she was a goddess of the screen. To Arthur, she was just the lady who smelled like spring and told him the world was waiting for him. The emotional climax of the evening didn't happen under the glare of the spotlights, but here, where the cost of her physical exhaustion was finally repaid in full, Marilyn felt a catharsis wash over her, a tear-jerking realization that her collapse was not a sign of failure, but the birth of a new kind of strength. She had spent her energy buying this boy a future, and in doing so, she had redeemed a piece of her own past. The pain in her body seemed to diminish as she watched the boy's small hand twitch toward the light. She was no longer the tragic figure the newspapers were currently inventing. She was a silent architect of hope. The waitress looked at Marilyn, her eyes overflowing with a gratitude that words could never navigate, seeing the woman behind the mask for the first time. Marilyn simply smiled, a genuine expression that didn't need to be captured by a camera to be real, knowing that the secret they shared would outlive the gowns and the diamonds. She had given him the 12 words he needed to survive, and he had given her the reason she needed to keep going. Marilyn stood up to leave, the leather-bound book of poetry resting on the bedside table as a permanent witness to their meeting. She knew she had to return to the world of artifice, but she was leaving a part of her heart behind in this room, guarded by an anonymous boy and his mother. For years, the medical bills just stopped coming. Mrs. Higgins would sit at her small kitchen table, the light from a single hanging bulb reflecting off the white envelopes that usually signaled a looming disaster, only to find they were already marked as settled in full. There was never a return address, never a signature, and never a request for a thank you. It was as if a silent guardian had placed a protective hand over their small apartment, ensuring that the wolf would never again howl at their door. Little Arthur continued to grow, his lungs becoming strong and his laughter filling the hallways that had once been silent with the fear of the light fading. Whenever Mrs. Higgins would try to inquire with the hospital accounting department, she was met with the same polite, scripted answer. The benefactor wishes to remain anonymous. After Marilyn's time on this earth was complete, the legal executors of her estate were combing through her private ledgers, expecting to find the typical expenses of a Hollywood star: jewelry, designer dresses, and luxury travel. Instead, they found a dedicated trust fund, sequestered away under a name that appeared on no movie poster and in no social registry. A silent reservoir of hope that sat untouched by publicists or agents, a mountain of gold intended for a single small boy in Queens who would never know the name of the woman who bought his future. This was a fund specifically designed to cover the medical journey of a boy from Queens, ensuring that every specialist visit, every breathing treatment, and every educational need was met until he reached the age of 21. This was the true legacy of the woman the world thought was only interested in diamonds and sequins. She had woven her own financial security into the survival of a stranger, turning her hard-earned fame into a quiet engine of mercy that outlived her physical presence. The story transitions from the glitz of the screen to the verifiable emotional truth of her hidden heart. In the journals that weren't meant for public consumption, there were small notes, barely more than scrawls, referencing the little poet in Queens. Marilyn had never told her closest friends about the boy, nor did she use her philanthropy to boost her public image during times of crisis. She kept this act of grace in a separate vault, far away from the transactional nature of show business. It was a purely emotional investment, a way for her to balance the scales of a life that often felt unfairly scrutinized. She knew that by the time the boy was old enough to understand, she might be gone, and she preferred it that way. She wanted him to love life, not a celebrity. This was the secret intimacy that the media of the time could never grasp. They were too busy discussing her breakdowns to notice the quiet architecture of hope she was building for a child who would never have to work a double shift in a catering kitchen just to breathe. She had spent her life being looked at, but through this boy, she had finally achieved the grace of truly being seen as a human being who mattered. Arthur grew up to be a man who always looked for the good in others, carrying a leather-bound book of poetry that he cherished more than gold. The hidden path she laid for him remained a secret for decades, known only to a few lawyers and a mother who kept a signed photo tucked behind a mirror. It would take a lifetime for the full scale of her generosity to be understood by a world that had always mistaken her kindness for instability. The dress was sold for millions, but the woman who wore it left behind something far more valuable. In the years following her departure, the world became obsessed with the artifacts of her existence. They clamored for the crystal-encrusted gown, the white mink stoles, and the letters penned in her famous hand, turning the items of her daily life into relics of a fallen saint. People looked at the sheer fabric of that iconic dress and saw only the glamour of a high society party, but they were staring at a silhouette while completely missing the soul that once inhabited it. We tend to judge the great figures of our past by their public collapses or their moments of visible fatigue, forgetting that the spirit often breaks only when it has carried far more than its fair share of the world's hidden sorrows. Marilyn's true legacy wasn't found in a glass auction case, but in the quiet, steady heartbeat of a man who grew up in Queens, unaware of the famous name that had signed for his oxygen. Reflection on her life reveals a woman who was constantly being measured by the length of her eyelashes and the pitch of her voice, while she was privately weighing the burdens of others. We often look at celebrities through a lens of judgment, waiting for the stumble that proves they are as flawed as we are. Yet, we rarely stop to consider the private acts of grace that lead to such a stumble. Her collapse that night wasn't a failure of character. It was the final, exhausted sigh of a woman who had given away her own air so that a stranger could breathe. The pacing of history slows down when we realize that the most important parts of a life are the moments no one photographs. Marilyn lived in a world of artifice, surrounded by people who wanted to take something from her. A look, a smile, a piece of her shine. By giving to the Higgins family without seeking credit or applause, she reclaimed a piece of her own humanity that the cameras could never touch. She chose to be a savior in the dark rather than a victim in the light. This is the catharsis of her story. The realization that even in a world that tries to turn us into products, we can remain architects of kindness. Success is often measured by the noise of the crowd, but Marilyn proved that it is truly found in the silence of an empty hospital bill and the soft rhythm of a child's safe slumber. She traded her composure for a boy's future, a trade she made without a single regret, proving that the most fragile things in this world are often the most durable. As we look back on the legend, we must learn to see past the blonde hair and the red lips to find the woman who was willing to fall if it meant holding someone else up. The final chapter of that evening was not written in the newspapers, but in the life of a boy who grew up to tell his own children that sometimes the most beautiful people are the ones who help you when you're invisible. If you look closely at the photos from that night, it is not the glitter of the crystals that holds the truth, but the knowing look in her eyes. While the world watched a celebrity fall, a silent transformation took place, turning a physical defeat into a spiritual victory for a child in a lonely ward. Marilyn Monroe showed us that being a miracle for one person is worth more than being a legend for millions. She traded her public image for the life of a boy she didn't know, teaching us that compassion is the only thing that truly survives. To the guests at the gala, she was a star who couldn't handle the shine, but to a mother in Queens, she was the miracle that ensured her son would see the sun rise. We should not see a tragedy, but a woman who reached out through the darkness to light a candle for a stranger. That is the beautiful truth of Marilyn. She fell so that others could rise, reminding us what it truly means to be human. She proved that even in the middle of a life filled with noise and artificiality, one can still hear the small, quiet voice of a heart that needs help. Her real reason for collapsing was not a lack of strength, but an abundance of it, spent entirely on a miracle she never asked to be credited for. If you believe that the most important people are the ones who show us kindness when no one is watching, please ring that notification bell and join our family of storytellers as we continue to find the human heart behind Hollywood's biggest legends. Marilyn's final smile was not for the cameras, but for the secret knowledge that across town, a little boy was finally breathing easily, safe in the world that she made sure was waiting for him.